Sometimes life confronts you with such profound silence that it feels as if the whole world has turned away. It is at this moment that the question arises that many avoid, but few dare to face. What if being alone is not a sign of weakness, but the first step to discovering a strength that almost no one knows? Some fear solitude, as if it were an invisible enemy, a threat that must be fought before it devours everything around it. But there is another side to this story, a side that only appears when you stop for a moment and realize that some of the brightest minds and most resilient personalities in history found precisely in solitude the key to their transformation. Perhaps you've already felt that strange discomfort when you distance yourself from people who, deep down, were never truly there for you. That emptiness that arrives when the noise of opinions fades and the only voice left is your own. Many panic at this point, as if the silence were too powerful an adversary to face. But others take a deep breath, confront this silence head-on, and discover that it's not as frightening as it seems. In fact, it may be the place where the answers you've always sought emerge, answers that were hidden behind distractions you've carried for years. It's curious how most people run to any company, even if it's bad, just to avoid dealing with the weight of isolation. They cling to empty conversations, fragile relationships, and meaningless commitments, all to fill the void left by loneliness. But those who truly grow, those who become mentally strong, do the exact opposite. They embrace moments of solitude and transform that space into an environment of growth. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because they understand that without going through this process, they will never discover who they truly are. And perhaps you've already realized that many of your greatest achievements happened when no one was watching. Loneliness has the power to reveal the truth we normally try to ignore. It places you face to face with yourself, unfiltered, without distractions, without excuses. And that's an experience few people are prepared to live through. After all, what's left when you remove everything you used to hide? What remains when the world falls silent and you have to deal with your own shadows, your doubts, and your deepest thoughts? It's at this point that many give up. But it's also at this point that the strong begin to transform. They realize that being alone doesn't mean being lost, but being free to rebuild their own mental structure. There is a strength that only arises when you don't depend on anyone's presence to feel whole. And this strength scares many people because it shows that you can walk alone without fear. You can make decisions without asking for approval. You can follow your own pace without comparing yourself to anyone. Loneliness is not a prison for those who know how to use it as a tool. It functions as a mirror that reflects not only what you are, but what you can become. And that is precisely where the difference lies between those who see loneliness as punishment and those who see it as a rare opportunity. Imagine for a moment what your life would be like if you didn't need anyone's opinion to pursue your goals. Imagine if you could think with total clarity, without noise, without interference, without energies that drain the best of you. Now imagine that this stronger version of yourself already exists. It's just hidden behind the fear of being alone. And perhaps it is this fear that prevents so many from achieving what they truly desire. Most people worry more about not losing people than about not losing themselves. And this creates a cycle that imprisons, suffocates, and limits any possibility of true growth. But there is a type of person who breaks this cycle. They choose to withdraw not out of arrogance, not out of coldness, not out of disinterest, but out of awareness. They understand that some phases of life require absolute withdrawal, strategic silence, and emotional distance. Such people don't isolate themselves to escape the world, but to rebuild themselves. And when they return, they come back stronger, more centered, and better prepared for any challenge. This strength cannot be bought, taught, or borrowed. It is born exclusively from those who accept walking alone when necessary. Have you ever wondered why some people reach such profound levels of emotional maturity, while others remain dependent on the gaze of others? Could the difference lie precisely in the ability to be alone without despairing? Are the strongest not those who avoid solitude, but those who manage to transform it into power? If this is true, then perhaps solitude is not an obstacle, but a path that few choose, but that completely changes those who have the courage to walk it. And it is precisely this path that we will begin to explore. Because when you understand why the strongest choose to be alone, you begin to realize that this same power is within your reach. And perhaps, after hearing everything that comes next, you will never see solitude in the same way again. There are moments in life when you feel like you're carrying an invisible weight, something that no one around you seems to notice. It might be that constant feeling of being out of sync with the world, as if everyone is following a song you can't hear. Perhaps you've experienced this at lunch with friends, when you suddenly realize that the conversations are meaningless, that people talk a lot but communicate little, and that all that presence around you only increases the feeling of emptiness. It's strange when you're surrounded by people and still feel alone, but it's even stranger when you realize that the silence of your own company is lighter than the noise of some people. Many people spend their entire lives running from this silence, chasing validation, companionship, or distractions to avoid facing the discomfort of being alone. But you've probably experienced that peculiar moment when you realize that, by distancing yourself a little from the world, something inside you begins to organize itself. It's like entering a messy room, closing the door, and finally seeing the mess that was previously hidden by the rush. And although it's uncomfortable at first, a sense of clarity begins to emerge when the external noise disappears. This clarity is one of the reasons why the strongest choose periods of isolation. It's there that the mind finally breathes. Sometimes this realization appears unexpectedly. It might be during a solitary walk in the late afternoon, when the wind brushes against your face and you perceive a strange peace in that moment, something no superficial conversation could offer. Or it might arise in the early hours of the morning when you're awake, thinking about life, reviewing decisions, confronting fears you never dared to admit. At those times, solitude doesn't seem like a punishment, but a kind of silent mirror that shows you everything you managed to ignore during the day. And perhaps it is precisely this mirror that transforms solitude into a powerful tool. It's curious how some everyday situations reveal more about you than long conversations with other people. That day when you're surrounded by expectations, commitments, and obligations, but everything inside you needs a break. Or that moment when you realize you're wasting energy trying to please someone who wouldn't do the same for you. These are simple details, but they show how much the wrong presence weighs more than the right absence. And when you start to identify these small inconsistencies, something inside you changes. You begin to choose better where you put your energy, and, inevitably, start to distance yourself from everything that doesn't add value. Often, this distancing isn't planned. It begins with small gestures, small refusals, small silences. You stop responding to messages you previously felt obligated to answer. You avoid gatherings you used to attend just to avoid disappointing anyone. And little by little, you begin to discover that the world doesn't crumble when you decide to prioritize yourself. On the contrary, it reorganizes itself. And in this process, you realize that not all the people who walked beside you were truly by your side. Some were only walking in the same direction out of convenience. Others were there to receive, not to give. This kind of revelation hurts, but it also liberates. And it is precisely at this point that something strange begins to happen. The more you distance yourself from superficial environments and empty relationships, the more you begin to feel whole. It's as if part of your energy, which was previously mercilessly drained, finally returns to you. And with this energy comes clarity, strength, focus. You become selective not out of arrogance but out of necessity, as if you finally understand that being accompanied doesn't mean being in good company. And here an inevitable question arises. What is more lonely? Being alone or being surrounded by people who don't understand who you really are? The answer isn't always simple, but it changes completely when you start to see patterns that previously went unnoticed. Perhaps you've already experienced that moment when you open up to someone and realize that the person isn't really listening. They're just waiting for their turn to speak. Or that instant when you realize you're fighting for people who would never fight for you. These are common experiences, but rarely admitted. And when you truly confront them, loneliness ceases to be a threat and becomes a conscious choice. This is where an element that few discuss but that the strongest know well comes in. Solitude is not just a refuge, it's a filter. It removes what is fragile, superficial, and distracting, leaving only what truly matters. It separates those who are truly with you from those who were merely occupying space. It exposes intentions, reveals priorities, and shows truths that lay hidden in the depths of small social interactions. And upon realizing this, something within you changes forever. You begin to understand that solitude is not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new one. This beginning, however, doesn't come without mystery, because when you consciously choose to be alone, you realize that something inside you transforms in a way you can't fully explain. A kind of stronger intuition emerges, a sharper emotional clarity, an almost hidden sense of perception. It's as if you begin to see invisible layers of human behavior, as if you instinctively understand who is worthwhile and who isn't. And this doesn't happen because of any special ability, but because of the absence of the noise that previously confused your mind. And perhaps that's why the strongest and most intelligent people throughout history have cultivated periods of isolation. Not because they wanted to distance themselves from the world, but because they wanted to see it better. Solitude offers a perspective that no group, no crowd, no influence can offer. It allows you to observe without being observed, to think without being interrupted, to feel without being manipulated. And often, it is at this point that you find answers that change the course of your life. Over time, you begin to realize that solitude not only reveals who you are, but also who you can become. It functions almost like fertile ground where ideas, thoughts, and perceptions previously stifled by pointless conversations finally find space to grow. Some of these insights arrive slowly, almost silently, while others emerge like a sudden punch to the gut. It is in this intimate and silent territory that you discover that true strength doesn't come from what you show the world, but from what you build when no one is watching. And the more you realize this, the more you begin to find a sense of inner power that doesn't depend on praise, applause, or validation. With a clearer mind, you begin to notice details that previously escaped you. You start to understand your emotions more accurately, recognize your patterns, identify your mistakes without so much judgment, and learn to value the process itself. Solitude transforms how you interpret the world, and especially how you interpret yourself. It challenges you to look at your deepest fears and realize that many of them only existed because you had never stopped to face them. And as this internal confrontation intensifies, a feeling of liberation arises that few people know. Something inside you begins to align in a way that, until then, seemed impossible. This clarity brings a strength that doesn't come from shouting louder, but from knowing exactly where you're placing your steps. And it's curious how, the deeper you delve into this state, the less tolerant you become of superficiality. Things that previously went unnoticed now reveal themselves with uncomfortable clarity. The falseness in some relationships, the lack of reciprocity in others, the heavy energy of environments that drain more than they add. It's as if solitude sharpens your senses and makes evident everything you previously ignored to maintain the illusion of normality. And then an inevitable question arises. How many people would you keep by your side if you fully understood their true intentions? This questioning often marks the beginning of an irreversible change. You start to choose more carefully who enters your emotional space. It's not about distrust, but about protection. When you realize the value of your own peace, you begin to defend it more firmly. And this silent defense often drives away those who were used to easy access. Some people disappear naturally. Others try to manipulate you with guilt or emotional pressure. But you are already in another cycle, at another level of perception. And when you understand this deeply, you discover that solitude strengthens you because it forces you to see what truly sustains you, when nothing and no one is holding you back. Sometimes, this change reveals itself in simple, almost banal moments that go unnoticed by those who aren't experiencing this process. It's when a hurtful comment stops affecting you, or when you realize you don't need to respond immediately to everything, or when for the first time you can say no without feeling guilty. These are silent but powerful achievements, and when they begin to accumulate, you feel a profound internal shift. as if you were reclaiming parts of yourself that were given to the world without you realizing it. This raises a question that may be unsettling. How much of your life has been shaped by other people's expectations, and how much truly came from you? This question often arises in solitude because it eliminates the external noise that has always influenced your choices. When the world is silent, you truly listen to yourself, and sometimes what you hear isn't comfortable. You discover that many decisions were made out of fear, many relationships maintained out of convenience, and many paths taken due to invisible imposition. But it is precisely this discovery that creates space for genuine freedom. You begin to make more conscious decisions. You start to perceive what you truly desire and what you merely tolerated. And for the first time, you understand that solitude is not the absence of people, but the presence of yourself. And at that point, something unexpected happens. When you begin to perceive yourself more clearly, your patterns of interaction begin to change. You stop accepting emotional crumbs because you finally understand your own worth. You stop seeking company out of neediness and start choosing based on affinity. You stop fearing silence and begin to cultivate it as part of your growth. And this change, silent yet powerful, completely alters the way you see the world. It's like exchanging foggy lenses for clear ones. Everything becomes clearer, more honest, more real. But this lucidity brings another inevitable question. Can you still live at the same pace you did before? The answer, almost always, is no. When you experience the depth of your own company, you realize that many environments are too shallow for those who are looking at the world more attentively. You realize that many relationships are too fragile for those who have become more whole. And you realize that many conversations are too empty for those who have learned to value silence. This disconnection doesn't make you superior, only more aware. And this awareness changes everything. You begin to sense when someone is lying, when someone is manipulating, when someone is trying to use you. Solitude sharpens your perception like few other processes can. And at the same time, it places you before an important revelation. Perhaps the strongest choose to be alone, because it is in silence that they see what most don't want to see. This expanded perspective profoundly transforms you. You begin to see social patterns as if you were viewing everything from above, observing movements, intentions, and masks. You realize how many people lean on groups not out of affinity, but out of fear of facing their own vulnerability. You realize how the constant need for attention is merely a disguise for insecurity. You realize how loud opinions hide silent uncertainties. And in seeing all this, you also perceive something essential. Perhaps solitude is uncomfortable for many because it removes all these masks, including your own. And then the final question of this part arises. If all illusions were removed from you now, what would remain? Loneliness began to reveal nuances that previously seemed invisible, as if each minute of silence opened a door to inner layers I didn't know existed. At first, I believed I was simply distancing myself from the noise of the world, but I realized I was entering unknown territories within myself. There's a specific moment, almost like a snap, when the mind realizes that no one is watching, no one is judging, and the weight of external expectations dissolves like smoke in the air. It is at this instant that something improbable happens. Perception shifts. Instead of seeking approval, curiosity arises about who you really are when you don't need to play any role. I remember walking down an almost empty road, hearing only the sound of my own footsteps, when I felt very clearly that time was passing differently. It was no longer rushed. It didn't pressure me. It seemed to have slowed down to allow me to observe. This feeling doesn't arise when we are surrounded by people. It appears when we are completely surrendered to our own rhythm. A curious study I discovered later said that the brain's perception of time changes when we are alone for long periods, creating a kind of expansion of consciousness that favors deeper reflections. That's exactly what I felt, as if my own memories were organizing themselves and beginning to show details I had never noticed before. Loneliness also showed me that many of the answers I sought were hidden in questions I never asked. It's strange to think that the absence of external voices amplifies our own. And when that voice becomes clear, it reveals uncomfortable but liberating truths. One of them was realizing how many decisions I made simply to maintain an image that doesn't even represent me. Only when silence became my only interlocutor could I see how many choices belonged to others, not to me. An unlikely event marked this phase. One day I found an old notebook I had written in years ago. In it I described dreams that no longer made sense, goals I abandoned out of fear, and behaviors I repeated without realizing it. Reading it alone, without distractions and without haste, had an impact I didn't expect. It was like looking at a version of myself that I hadn't yet dared to be honest with. The solitude forced me to confront this comparison head-on. And the most surprising thing is that I felt neither shame nor frustration. I felt clarity. It seemed as if that notebook had been kept to be read precisely at that moment, when I had the mental space to truly understand it. From then on, I realized that solitude is a kind of mirror that doesn't lie. It highlights our contradictions, illuminates our excesses, and reveals our strength. It's common to think that being isolated weakens us, but try being alone long enough to realize that no external noise can compete with the lucidity that comes from silence. Gradually, I realized that many of the conflicts I thought came from the world were, in fact, unresolved internal battles. And when the mind is quiet, these battles reveal themselves with impressive clarity. A curious fact I discovered later reinforced this perception. Researchers observed that when a person remains alone for long voluntary periods, the brain activates areas related to creativity, planning, and introspection. In other words, solitude is not emptiness. It's a laboratory. That's what I felt. Ideas I would never have had before began to emerge naturally, as if my brain were finally functioning correctly, without interference, without distractions, and without the emotional drama that accompanies the constant need for interaction. But perhaps the most fascinating thing of all was noticing how solitude changes the way we see other people. When you spend enough time with yourself, you learn to observe details that previously went unnoticed. Small gestures, tones of voice, intentions hidden behind simple phrases. It seems almost improbable, but the emotional distance generated by solitude allows you to better understand who is really around you and who is just taking up space. It's not a bitter conclusion, but a liberating one. When you learn to be comfortable alone, you stop accepting presences that drain your energy. This phase brought me a kind of peace I didn't know I was looking for. Not a romantic or idealized peace, but a practical peace, the kind that allows you to take a deep breath and make precise decisions. Suddenly, choices that previously seemed confusing became obvious. Paths I avoided out of insecurity became natural. Solitude created clarity, and clarity created strength. In the end, I realized that being alone wasn't a withdrawal from the world. It was a reunion with myself. And this reunion changed everything, as if I had finally returned to a place I should never have left. As the days passed, solitude ceased to be merely an experience of introspection and began to assume a deeper, almost challenging role. I noticed subtle changes in my behavior, as if something inside me was reorganizing itself without asking permission. It was an ambiguous feeling, a mixture of tranquility with a certain silent weight, as if something unexpected were about to happen at any moment. And in fact, it did. It was one night when the silence was so intense it seemed to touch the walls, when I felt an unease I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, but a kind of internal alert, an instinct that awoke for no apparent reason. I decided to go for a walk, trying to understand that strange feeling. The street was empty, and each step echoed as if the whole world was paying attention to me. The darkness didn't scare me, but there was something different about that night. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. A message from someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. Someone who was part of a phase of my life that I thought I had left behind. The message was short, almost enigmatic. "We need to talk. It's important." That shattered my calm in a way I hadn't expected. It was as if the past had chosen that exact moment to return, just when I was learning to rebuild myself. I stopped in the middle of the street, staring at the screen as if I could find some explanation in the pixels. For a few seconds, I felt a strange tension, as if I were being watched by something invisible. The solitude, which had once been comfortable, transformed into a space of doubt. I began to wonder if I had truly resolved everything within myself, or if I had merely swept some truths under the emotional rug. The words in that message were few, but they carried enormous weight because they came from someone who knew parts of me that I myself avoided facing. I decided not to reply right away. I went home with my heart racing, trying to understand why a simple notification had affected me so much. When I arrived, I realized that the unease didn't come from the person, but from what they represented. They symbolized an older version of myself, a version that needed to be confronted so I could move forward. The loneliness, which seemed so revealing, now demanded more. It demanded courage. I sat on the living room floor in the dark, letting the darkness fill every space. It was as if the silence was waiting for my decision. The next day, I woke up with a clearer mind, but my heart was still pounding. I spent the morning reflecting until I realized something that struck me almost painfully. Loneliness doesn't just show us who we are, it also shows us what we still need to face. That's when I replied to the message, maintaining a neutral but firm tone. Minutes later, the reply came with disconcerting speed. The person suggested a meeting. At that moment, I felt my whole body react, as if I were about to walk through a door of no return. I spent the whole day thinking about how a simple reunion could carry so much tension. I was no longer the person I was when we drifted apart, and at the same time, I didn't know if that change would be strong enough to keep me stable in the face of someone who had been able to shake me so much. Loneliness had strengthened me, but the real test would happen outside, in real interaction, outside my inner world. This created a kind of intense anticipation, as if I were living the prelude to an inevitable upheaval. When I finally arrived at the agreed-upon location, I realized my whole body was on high alert. There was a strange feeling of familiarity mixed with a cold distance. Upon seeing the person, I felt something I hadn't expected. It wasn't pain, nor longing, nor anger. It was simply awareness. Awareness that I had changed more than I imagined. The conversation began with a heavy silence, broken by cautious phrases. Gradually, I understood that the person wasn't there to reopen old wounds, but to close chapters. The reason for the message was simple yet profound. She too had undergone transformations and wanted to resolve unfinished business from the past. In the midst of that conversation, I had a realization that hit me like a shock. Solitude had prepared me for that moment. Each reflection, each silence, each inner discomfort had built a solid foundation that now allowed me to look at the past with strength and not with fragility. What had previously been an emotional storm became just another stage in my growth. I realized that the tension I felt didn't come from the situation itself, but from the fear of discovering that I was still vulnerable to what had already hurt me. But I wasn't. And this realization brought an unexpected calm. When we said goodbye, I felt something different inside me. It wasn't relief nor sadness. It was a feeling of profound liberation, as if I had finally closed a cycle that had dragged on for years. And it was at that moment that I understood the true purpose of solitude. It doesn't isolate us from the world. It strengthens us to return to it in a more conscious and less dependent way. As I walked back, I felt such intense clarity that it seemed to illuminate everything around me. Solitude was no longer a refuge, but a silent force that I carried with me. This unexpected episode marked the point at which I realized that the inner journey was coming to an end. But the denouement had not yet arrived. The expectation now was not one of fear, but of discovery. Solitude had transformed me, and I knew that the next step would reveal how far this transformation could take me. The story didn't end there. It was merely preparing for its final move. When I returned home that night, I felt that something inside me had finally found a resting place. It wasn't the end of loneliness, but the end of a silent struggle I had been waging with myself for a long time. The walk, the unexpected encounter, the conversation that closed a cycle, it all seemed to have fallen into place like pieces I didn't even know were missing. For the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't running away from the world, nor protecting myself from it. I was rebuilding myself, and this rebuilding had a clear purpose: to allow me to live again with more presence, awareness, and strength. As I sat on the sofa, I felt the weight of the silence, but this time in a different way. It wasn't a silence that threatened to swallow me whole. It was a welcoming silence. It was as if it were saying, "Now you are ready. Ready to face whatever comes. Ready to let go of what no longer makes sense. Ready to move more lightly without carrying stories that have already served their purpose." I understood that loneliness is not transformed solely by the absence of people, but by the absolute presence of ourselves. And this presence is something that many avoid, because it requires facing one's own flaws, fears, and desires without filters. While reflecting on everything I had experienced, I realized that true strength lies not in appearing unshakable, but in recognizing one's own limitations and still moving forward. Loneliness teaches us this silently. It places us before mirrors that don't lie, showing us versions of ourselves that we try to hide, and revealing layers we didn't even know existed. The inevitable question that arises is, how many times do we avoid being alone not because we fear the void, but because we fear what we will find within it? And how many opportunities for growth do we let pass simply for fear of hearing our own voice? As the hours passed, I felt something was different. It was as if I had crossed an inner door that only opens once, and after that, it never closes in the same way again. Solitude, which had previously been a territory of introspection, became a space of clarity. I began to see decisions I needed to make, conversations I should still have, paths I had been postponing for fear of change. Gradually, it became evident that there are moments in life when choosing to be alone is not isolation, but a strategy of self-healing, of strengthening, and of aligning with what truly matters. It was then that I realized that many people live surrounded by external noise simply to avoid hearing what their own hearts are trying to say. Solitude cuts through this noise. It creates fertile ground for reorganizing priorities, healing wounds, and discovering genuine desires. And the most curious thing is that when we finally embrace this process, we begin to realize that nothing that truly matters is outside of ourselves. The answers we desperately seek in the outside world were almost always already there, hidden beneath layers of distractions, expectations, and fears. Therefore, ask yourself, what have you been avoiding facing within yourself? And to what extent has this hindered your growth? As dawn approached, I felt an urge to start something new. It wasn't a specific idea, but a feeling of movement. As if everything I had experienced hadn't happened merely to help me understand the past, but to prepare me for a completely different future. I realized that solitude had transformed from an emotional state into a tool, a powerful tool, capable of shaping thoughts, strengthening convictions, and building resilience. It was no longer an end, but a means. And for the first time, I understood that choosing to be alone is not about distancing oneself from people, but about getting closer to oneself. This understanding brought an almost physical liberation, as if I had let go of something I had carried on my shoulders for years. The tension disappeared, giving way to a firm, secure calm that depended on no one but myself. And it is precisely this emotional independence that so many people seek, but few find, because it requires courage to enter inner territories that we often prefer to ignore. But when we cross this path, when we face the silence without fear, we discover that it is not an enemy, but a guide that points to what we need to transform, abandon, or embrace more strongly. Looking out the window before bed, I saw the reflection of the sleeping city. Scattered lights, empty streets, a seemingly ordinary scene, but one that night seemed to carry a different meaning. I felt that solitude had fulfilled its purpose. It took me where I needed to be, shaped me, confronted me, and ultimately strengthened me. Now, the choice to be alone ceased to be a necessity and became a possibility to return to the world not out of neediness, but out of awareness. And that is a gigantic difference, because when we are complete inside, nothing on the outside has the power to bring us down in the same way. And that's what I want to leave you with today. Solitude, when consciously chosen, is a powerful path to true strength. It teaches you to listen to yourself, to understand yourself, and to rebuild yourself. And when you learn to walk alone, you also learn to walk with others again, without losing yourself in the process. If you feel you need this time, This silence, this reconnection with who you truly are. Allow yourself to experience it. Don't run away. Don't get distracted. Don't sabotage yourself. The strength you seek may be precisely in the space you've been avoiding looking at. And when you finally decide to enter it, you will discover that you always had more power than you imagined. If this message touched you in any way, please like this video. Leave a comment, even anonymously if you prefer, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey with me. Your participation is what keeps this space alive, and together, we can transform every silence into strength, every reflection into movement, and every moment of solitude into an opportunity to be reborn.